Hale Esfandiari. I run the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. We have been holding a series of meetings on Egypt since the recent development in that country. And the next one, I think, is going to be on the 7th, the meeting on Egypt, the 6th, on April 6th in the afternoon. We are delighted to have with us today Sahar Muhammad Khamis. She's going to speak on the new media and political change in Egypt, causes, implications, and communication strategies. Sahar is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, so she didn't have a long way to come here. We are in College Park. And she's an expert on Arab media and the former head of the Mass Communication and Information Science Department in Qatar University. She's the co-author of the book Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourse in Cyberspace. She also authors chapters in the books Women and Media in the Middle East, Power Through Self-Expression, and also New Media and the New Middle East. And I think she has a very long bio. I'll stop here and let her speak because I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, including myself. Sahar, welcome to the center.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hela. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon in the Middle East program of the Woodrow Wilson Center. And my presentation this afternoon is going to be about new media and political change with special reference to the latest events in Egypt and the causes that led to the Egyptian revolution, its implications locally, regionally, and internationally, and of course, my special area of expertise on communication and new media, especially with the comparison between the communication strategies used by the government on one hand vis-a-vis the people on the other hand. Thank you very much. And I'm very glad Dr. Hala was able to pronounce my name correctly, which not very many people do, believe it or not. So I was happy to hear Sahar Muhammad Khamis. I was so happy. Yeah.
Come from the region.
So I would like to start first by talking about the causes of the Egyptian revolution. What were some of the most important causes that actually led up to the Egyptian revolution? It's no secret that Egypt has been struggling with 30 years of dictatorship and autocratic rule under the late President Hosni Mubarak. And also that was coupled with a high level of corruption. It is no secret that the former president, now it was found that he had a fortune of between 40 to 70 billion US dollars. The Egyptian people are, of course, demanding that this money, is returned back to the country. The emergency law has been in place for many years in Egypt, leading to severe limitations and restrictions on the amount of freedom and freedom of expression that is allowed to the Egyptian people and to the citizens to express themselves. The faulty constitution is another factor that has really caused a lot of anger among the Egyptian people at large because it gave unlimited powers and authorities to the Egyptian president. It did not limit his term in power or his term in office or how much authority he has. And these are all elements that they are now seeking to change and modify. This is also coupled with a high level of economic distress. At least 40% of the Egyptian people are living under the international poverty line with an income as little as $2 or less per day. Growing calls for constitutional, economic, political, and social reform have been heard in the country for many years. So it's not like the Egyptian people were very happy and satisfied, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, they are bursting out and asking for a revolution and drastic changes. That is not the case. It has been really what we can call, a pot that has been boiling for a long time, and now the lid has popped off. Forging the latest parliamentary elections in Egypt has been a major trigger for people's anger and resentment that led up to the Egyptian revolution. The latest parliamentary elections in Egypt were really a big scandal and an insult because they were very clearly and outwardly forged to the extent where a lot of the groups that had some kind of popular following or popularity among the Egyptian people, the Muslim Brotherhood as one example, did not win any seats whatsoever in the parliament, leading to the odd and strange situation of having a parliament with no opposition. So it's a parliament that was predominantly and overwhelmingly only representing the National Democratic Party, only those in power and not the opposition. Another major trigger for the revolution that has to be highlighted and really pinpointed is the successful popular revolution that has taken place in Tunisia before the Egyptian revolution. And I think that the Tunisian people did have an impact on the events that went on in Egypt. They inspired the young Egyptian people, the youth in particular, to see that this is a possibility, that they can really go out there in the street and do something. If you don't like what's going on in your country, don't feel helpless, don't feel powerless. You have the power and you can really change things to the better. And I've seen some very interesting messages going back and forth on Facebook pages between the young Tunisian youth and the Egyptian youth, where the Tunisian youth are saying, you know, we did it, you can do it, just go for it, you know, be courageous enough, go out in the street, rally people behind you, and you will be able to impact society and really bring about change. And they even gave them some kind of strategic and tactical clues as to how to go about doing that, what they should and should not do. Like, you know, you can throw some kind of black paint at the government's, vehicles in order to prevent them from proceeding further. You can throw rocks, you can do things which are not necessarily, quote unquote, armed resistance or violent resistance, but can be very effective strategies in terms of combating the government and fighting against the government. So there was very interesting to see this kind of back and forth dialogue where the Tunisian people did have an impact really on the events that went on in Egypt afterwards. Of course, if we were to look at the multiple implications of the Egyptian revolution on different levels, as I said, locally, regionally, and internationally, we have a lot to say in this respect. First of all, the implications for Egypt are indeed tremendous. It charged the Egyptian people with a new sense of positivity, empowerment, determination, pride, and solidarity. A lot of people tell me, we have never felt more proud before in our lives to be Egyptians. And my own family members included. My whole family, my father, my mother, my sisters, they were all part of the demonstrations and the protests. They all went out there in Tahrir Square, and they've taken part in the demonstrations, and I really wish I was there in order to join them too. It's a peaceful, youthful, and grassroots revolution that was across the board. It means it involved different political, religious, and social groups. So we cannot really point fingers at one single particular sector or group and say, this is the particular group or sector or organization that can be given credit for the Egyptian revolution, because it's across the board and it represented different lines of thought, different political and religious trends. It was really across the board, involving everybody. And we cannot say the Muslim Brotherhood was behind it. We cannot say the leftists were behind it. They were all led by this peaceful, youthful, grassroots revolution. Also, what is unique about the Egyptian revolution is the fact that it's a leaderless revolution. We cannot, again, point out to one particular person and give him or her credit. Some people try to give credit, to Wa'il Ghunaim, the Google guy who was detained for 12 days, hopefully not 12 years, for 12 days in Egypt. They try to give him credit for being a hero. And he said, I'm not a hero. I'm not the one who triggered this revolution. I'm not the one who caused it. I'm just someone among many, many others who contributed to this revolution, but I cannot be given credit for it, and I'm not a hero. Unity between Muslims and Coptic Christians was a very interesting, again, manifestation that really, revealed itself. We have seen very interesting images of Muslims praying in the middle of Tahrir Square, performing the Friday prayers in the middle of Tahrir Square while being protected by their fellow citizens, the Coptic Christians, who formed some kind of human shield with their own body in order to protect their fellow Muslim citizens. And vice versa, there were Christians who were performing the Sunday prayers in the middle of Tahrir Square while being protected by their Muslim fellow citizens. So this sense of unique solidarity was also a great thing. Beside the significant role of youth, there was also a significant role for women. women did play a significant role as not just participants, but even leaders in this revolution. Asma Mahfouz, the woman who was one of the people who really called for the 25th of January, revolt and going out in the streets and rallying people through Facebook pages and encouraging them to organize themselves, and others. There were so many women across the boards, veiled, unveiled, face veiled, you name it. They were all there. They were joining hands. They were chanting slogans. They were even leading the demonstrations and the protests in a very courageous and extraordinary way. And I'm optimistic about the future of women, from now on in Egypt and in the region at large. I hope that this will be only the beginning of a much greater role for women in Egypt and in the rest of the Arab world. It's a new era of social and democratic reform in Egypt. There is no question about it. And as President Barack Obama put it in one of his interviews, Egypt will not go back to where it was before January 25th. So the road for change and democratization and reform has started, and it's unlikely that it's going to turn back. The clock is not going to turn back to where it was before January 25th, 2011. Also, there are multiple implications for the Arab world or the Arab region. We can now talk about what is called the domino effect or the ripple effect. There are echoes of both the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolutions that we are now witnessing in Libya, in Yemen, in Bahrain, and in Syria, to mention only some. We are now seeing this ripple effect, the spreading of, the new era of Arab empowerment and awakening and strength is really spreading all over the Arab region now. Arab rulers started for the first time to take some steps in the direction of political reform. So we have heard some of these Arab rulers now, whether they started to have uprisings in their own countries or not yet, they're starting to already talk about, okay, we are going to engage in more, reform, in more political change, and trying to listen for the first time to the Arab street. So the Arab governments cannot afford to ignore the power of the Arab street or the power of the public opinion in their own countries anymore. Before, they did not pay attention to what the people had to say, to the demands of their own people. But that is now, largely changing, and they cannot afford, after this, sweeping wave of change and the demonstrations and revolutions, they cannot afford to just ignore what the Arab street is saying and what their own people are demanding. So it's a new era of political change, empowerment, and awakening, which already started in the Arab world at large. And in my opinion, this is only the beginning, and it's most likely to spread to other countries and to go on in the future. The international implications, we also have to talk about some of the international implications for the Egyptian revolution and the revolutions in the Arab world at large. I think it will require definitely revisiting the U.S. foreign policy. I think that the clear message that the American administration is starting to pick up and to listen to is that forging alliances with corrupt dictators who suppress their own people under the claim of preserving stability is not going to be an effective strategy from now on. It is no secret that a lot of the Arab autocrats and dictators have ruled with an iron fist in their own countries, while always trying to, show that they are the guardians of stability in the region. If we are gone, there's going to be chaos, there's going to be disruption. We are here in order to guard stability. But the fact is, under suppression and repression, there is no true stability. There is only a boiling pot with a lid that's ready to pop off any minute. We've already seen this, lid popping off in many Arab countries, and many more are to come. So the genie is out of the jar or the bottle, and it's very hard to get it contained again and to put the lid back again on it. Also, I think another very important message here is stopping to accept or to buy into the Islamic scare strategy, which legitimizes oppression of people as a means to curb Islamic influence or the process of re-Islamization, playing on people's fear or what is called the Islamophobia. It is no secret that a lot of the Arab rulers and autocrats like, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, like Mubarak, a lot of them, they actually played on this Islamophobia, the Islamic scare. If we are out of office, guess who you're going to be getting instead? You're going to be getting some Islamic boogeyman. You're going to be getting the Muslim Brotherhood. You're going to be getting some kind of radicalized Islamic government. And that is not the case, because take example of Egypt, take the example of Tunisia. These were grassroots movements across the board. They represented everybody, Muslims and Christians, leftists and communists and Islamists. It was really involving everyone, and we cannot say that they were quote-unquote Islamic revolutions or that they will lead to Islamic governments. Peace and security in the region as a whole, especially, of course, with special reference to the Israeli-Arab conflict, cannot be achieved except through fair and equitable relations between neighbors, not through strong armies and superior weapons. It is no secret that also there has been some kind of worry about, what's going to happen now in terms of, for example, the, relations between Israel and its neighbors. In my, modest view, I think the only way to go about creating, a peaceful coexistence in the region is really trying to resolve the key issues here in a fair and equitable way that would preserve good relations between neighbors. Strong armies, strong weapons, armaments, all of that stuff is not going to be the best protection. It's going to be just some kind of superficial strategy that will not lead to a lasting peace. We need to have another revolution now, a revolution for peace in the Middle East and in between Israel and the Arab world, and I hope there are going to be courageous steps taken in this direction. Now, my area of expertise, the changing Arab media landscape. I just want to give you a brief overview of what the media landscape looked like in the Arab world in recent years in order to set the stage for the conversation that will follow about the government's media strategies or communication strategies vis-a-vis the Egyptian people's communication strategies. And the Arab media before the year 1990 had very monolithic, uniform, strong governmental control and ownership over the media. There was no diversity, no plurality, or no freedom of expression. In many of the Arab countries, you can only hear the government, what the government had to say, national and state-controlled media. We always saw images of the president or the first lady meeting somebody, greeting somebody, or saying farewell to somebody. And that was all you get to see on the news bulletins, 99% of the time. Arab media after 1990 changed dramatically. And the introduction of new media in the region, such as satellite television channels, the proliferation of the internet, created new avenues for spreading information and fueling opposition to the government. So now it's not like you get only the controlled, a national state-controlled media that the government is always, monopolizing. Now you get hundreds, of satellite channels, Arab and foreign, and you can get zillions of websites on the internet. You can just click, any button and get any kind of news you want. You would even be surprised if I tell you that because I do ethnographic work in rural Egypt, I discovered in my last round of data collection that even rural areas, like small villages in Egypt, are now having access to the internet and having access to satellite television. So think about what kind of implications that could have in terms of changing people's information diet. The paradox in the past has been that these alternative new media channels and avenues did not lead in the past to a transition to political mobilization or democratization until 2011. So the academics who were writing on this issue, including myself, we were very perplexed by this kind of puzzling paradox. How come there is more space for, diversity, opposition, attacking the government, making fun of the president, attacking the ruling party, and at the same time, the Arab street is not being mobilized. Everything is static. Everything is stagnant on the political front. How can we really account for this kind of paradox, for this kind of gap? And one explanation that we have offered for it is the safety valve explanation for the media's role. We said that, okay, maybe these rulers and autocrats are deliberately leaving some, space for freedom of expression, for people to talk and to criticize and to oppose and to have their views expressed so that they do not actually explode with some kind of revolution or some kind of, uprising on a massive scale. So if they're angry, let them vent their emotions or their anger through the media, through the opposition papers, through some of these satellite channels, so that we avoid the potential, outburst of anger that might lead to a revolution or an uprising. That was the explanation we had until, of course, 2011, when we started to see the revolutions really sweeping the region. Now I would like to draw a comparison between the Egyptian government's communication strategies that were used during and after and through this revolution and the people's own communication mechanisms and strategies. The Egyptian government actually combined the suppression of protesters and demonstrators on the streets with the suppression of the truth through national state-controlled media. So there was a phenomenon we can call double suppression, if you like. Okay? There was suppression on the political front and also suppression on the communication front. Cracking down on foreign journalists is something that we have seen, in several incidents. There were celebrities who were cracked down on, like, for example, Anderson Cooper and others on the streets of Cairo were hassled, their cameras were taken away from them, and those who did these kinds of acts were not the peaceful, youthful demonstrators. They were the thugs of the political party or the ruling government. Closing down the office of Al Jazeera in Cairo and detaining its director, the director of Al Jazeera office in Cairo, of course, trying to block Al Jazeera from performing its job, because Al Jazeera, for those of you who have been following the news and the events, has been the most outspoken avenue of spreading news and information, covering the events in Egypt and in other parts of the Arab world as well. 24/7 coverage that was devoted to the events going on in Egypt minute by minute. And of course, the Egyptian government did not like that very much. They were not very fond of Al Jazeera for obvious reasons, and that's why they closed down the office in Cairo and detained the director. Cutting off the cell phone lines for a few days and blocking off the internet connection for a whole week. It's what we can describe as pushing down the kill switch. So, for example, an Egyptian citizen like myself living here in the United States, I had a very difficult time for a few days getting in touch with my own family members back in Egypt. I knew that they were joining the protests, that they were going out to the demonstrations. I was really worried about them naturally, but I was not able to contact them either by phone or through the internet. So it was a very difficult experience. The government essentially used the mentality of the 50s and the 60s. The mentality that we can simply block off the country completely from the rest of the world. We can control all the forms of communication. We can cut off the cell phones. We can cut off the internet. We can leave people in the dark, and we can block off the communication and the flow of messages. But of course, the mentality of the 50s and the 60s cannot succeed in the year 2011. So that's why I'm saying it's a failed and incompetent political and communication strategy. I think the government used very ineffective, incompetent policies, both on the political front as well as the communication front. On the other hand, the people's communication strategies were very effective and very efficient. They were able to deploy new media, especially the youth, the young people. They were posting and chatting on Facebook, tweeting, blogging, and texting, and they were using all of these new media and new forms of communication very effectively and very efficiently. One of my colleagues even said Facebook became the people's book, right? It's a book where people can write their own thoughts, ideas, comments, and they can really share their own strategies and tactics about what needs to be done and what is the best way to go about doing it. And I would share the view that some people, said it can even be described as a Facebook revolution, because it really started through some of the activist youth who used Facebook very effectively. There's a group which is called Kullina Khalid Saeed, We Are All Khalid Saeed, which honors the memory of a young Egyptian accountant, Khalid Saeed, who was unfortunately beaten up to death by the Egyptian police in Alexandria because he allegedly posted or uploaded a video on YouTube that showed some of the malpractices and corruption of some of the Egyptian police officials. So, some youth, they got together as an activist group and they created this Facebook group called Kullina Khalid Saeed to honor his memory and to move forward with some kind of radical reform and change in the country. That created the missing link between mediated self-expression through the media and street mobilization, between the virtual world and the real world. So up till January 2011, we were really seeing this gap I was talking to you about earlier, this kind of paradox where we cannot account for or understand why there is this gap between the more liberated, diverse, opposition in the media, and why there is this stagnation on the Arab street. So that created this missing link thanks to the new media like Facebook and blogs and Twitter, and of course, first and foremost, the young people, the young activists who deployed them and used them effectively. They also were very successful in finding alternative creative ways to access and spread information. When the government tried to use the mentality of the 50s and the 60s and to block forms of communication and to cut down cell phones and cut down the internet, the Egyptian youth did not just sit there doing nothing. They started to resort to other alternatives. One of them, for example, is called the speak-to-tweet service, whereby you can just call the Twitter service through some kind of Google-enabled system. You can just give them a call and feed your message as a voice message to Twitter, and it's going to appear on Twitter online. So it does not require that you have online access. You don't have access to the internet, but you can just call a number, talk to Twitter, speak to Twitter, and then have your message appear online. They use this service. And also when the Egyptian government stopped carrying Al Jazeera on Nilesat, the Egyptian people started to resort to Hotbird in order to have access to Al Jazeera broadcasting. So they were very, very effective in using alternative ways and alternative methods to get their message across. And let me also point an interesting and important point here. In fact, the blocking of communication by the government, like cutting off the cell phone lines and the internet, did not help the government's cause in terms of blocking the protesters and the demonstrators. We can even say that it backfired. Because instead of meeting their friends and their other activist members online, if you cannot get hold of them online or through Facebook, what do? You go down to Tahrir Square and you meet them there. So in a way, it backfired completely, and it was counterproductive to what the government was trying to do, and it may have even fueled more the sense of activism and protest and demonstration in the Egyptian streets. I would like to really pinpoint a number of very important multiple roles that we can say that new media have played in the midst of this Egyptian revolution. They could be said to be catalysts that paved the way for a democratic transition. And they were also platforms for self-expression, which young people used very effectively to express their thoughts and organize their own actions and movements. They were channels for communication and organization. They were bridge builders between the young activists and their followers, and between the virtual world and the real world. They were avenues for civic engagement and popular participation, therefore marking the shift in the role from just safety valves to effective mobilization tools. And they were also arenas for a new form of citizen journalism. That's a very important and interesting point I'd like to draw your attention to, because we have seen young activists in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, in many parts of the Arab world where the empowerment and awakening is taking place, really resorting to new forms of media to feed their own videos and accounts of what's going on in the ground. They were able to use their handheld devices, their mobile phones, right, their cell phone cameras, to record what is actually going on there, minute by minute. And sometimes there were these shocking videos, of cars running over demonstrators, or, the police shooting at some kind of civilian who is very clearly unarmed and does not have any weapons on him. There's just some shocking, images that you would never, ever get except through this form of courageous, citizen journalism. So that's another very important point we have to really acknowledge in this context. And finally, if we were to look ahead, I would just like to pinpoint some, remarks that I think are important in terms of Egypt after Mubarak, or the road ahead, or the future. It's very clear there is no turning back. The road to democratization and reform has already started, and the likelihood is it's going to continue. And it's going to continue with more strength. And as we said before, it's not only confining itself to Egypt, but it's actually spreading through the domino effect or the ripple effect to many other parts of the Arab world. The transition to democratization needs to be done swiftly, but also safely, because there are, those who are now, saying, oh, it's going so slowly, we want things to be done more quickly. And there are those who are saying, wait a minute, it cannot happen overnight. If you talk about things like reforming the constitution or, running for new presidential elections, all of these things have to really be taken into account very carefully and very cautiously. So there are these two different camps or different, points of view between Egyptians now, those who are very eager to have the changes done sooner rather than later. And of course, that represents more of the young activists and those who are behind the revolution. And then there are some more conservative voices that are more, keen to have things take their time and reform to be given sufficient thought before being acted out. A new era of civic engagement and popular participation is very obvious, with the grassroots movement being across the board, involving young activists and using the new media. A greater role for youth leadership. With young people now, the youth in the region, they're playing a much more effective and active role more than ever before. They are the ones who feel that they are now, for the first time, being capable to draw the map, if you like, for their country's future. It's a beautiful feeling of empowerment, which they did not enjoy for 30 years. Also, I anticipate and predict and hope for a greater role for women and women's participation, judging from the role that they have played, during the Egyptian revolution. They did not just play the role of participants, as I said, but they even emerged at many points as leaders in their own right. So I'm hoping that they will continue to demand their rights and to really play a more effective role in planning for Egypt's future. And we are seeing now already women activists saying, oh, the Egyptian constitution talks about the president as being only a man. It's a he. He should be 40 years old. He should be an Egyptian national. He. That does not leave a room for a she. We want to be also able to run for president at one point. So there has to be an amendment in the phrasing of the constitution to enable women to run for the position of president. This is just an example among many that is now being voiced by women activists who want to play a greater role in their country's future. A greater role for new media, definitely, as mobilization tools. As I said, now the media are in everybody's hands. I even told you in rural areas, where you would least expect them. They're now very, very prevalent, and people can use cell phones, they can use the internet, they can use satellite television much easier than ever before, and they are deploying them for good purposes in order to spread awareness of their political causes and to enact the change that they want to see. Enhancing Egypt's position of leadership in the Arab world. I've now been hearing, very positive messages from, Arab countries, people in other parts of the Arab world saying, we now look up to Egypt again as, restating its position of leadership in the region as a political leader, as a cultural leader. We look up to the Egyptian example. It's really great how people were able to topple this, dictatorship that was there for 30 years. So I feel that there's this, again, Egypt regaining its position of leadership in the Arab world. Also enhancing Egypt's international image and reputation. I have been getting equally enthusiastic messages from non-Arab friends and colleagues and, people that I know here in the States and other parts of the world, sending emails and messages and saying, congratulations for Egypt. We are very enthusiastic. We are very proud of the Egyptian people. That is really a model to be emulated in other parts of the world. And, there is this sense of pride and celebration, really, which really was very overwhelming for me and for many Egyptians. And I would like to stop here and give you a chance for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sahar. Let me ask the first question. You gave us a very upbeat, a very grim past, a very upbeat future. But what we hear also from our friends in Egypt is also a state of concern that this may not happen the way you hope it will happen. Talk a little bit about the concern, the worries. Just to give you an example, some women with whom we have worked in the past, and not necessarily secular women, but activist women, women who were in Tahrir Square, women who were part of this generation that you referred to, are worried that women would be marginalized, just to give you one as example. Another thing is that if there were no women in the commission that redrafted those articles while the head of that commission, I think, was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and another member was a lawyer, for example. So there are those also who believe that if there are free elections, which they should be, there would be the Muslim Brotherhood will gain maybe a majority or will have a substantial voice. And where do they stand, for example, on women's issues? Where do, so if you would also talk a little bit about the concern of those people who don't see this developing the way you see.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I'm still obviously in a celebratory mode. I like to maintain the celebratory mode for some time. Yeah. But one question I always keep getting from American friends is like, what comes next? What comes next? What happens in Egypt now? And really, Dr. Hela is correct in what she is saying, in that there is a division of opinion. It's not like everybody in Egypt is so optimistic. I was talking to my father, for example, yesterday, and he had his concerns about the transition to democratization, because although he is not one of the youth, obviously, who really were behind the revolution, he was a very active supporter for it, who went out to Tahrir Square, among others. And he is saying the reforms are not going as quickly as they should, and that the army, which is now in charge of this transitional stage, is trying sometimes to halt or to slow down the reform process, much to the dismay or disappointment or concern of many of the activists who were behind the revolution or those who were cheering for it. So in other words, there are these two different groups, as I said in my presentation, those who want to see the reforms go forward more quickly, and they fear that the prolonging of this transitional stage would halt or would put some obstacles in the way of true reform. For example, they think that the latest referendum on the constitution should not have taken place. There should have been a change in constitution rather than an amendment of the constitution. But, a lot of people were confused. They did not know exactly what they were doing. The good sign is we have seen for the first time 18 million Egyptian people, men and women, old and young, going out and actually voting. That is something we have not seen before, because people were so apathetic. They said, if we know the result of the elections in advance or the referendum in advance, why should we go? So the good side is there is now political activism and enthusiasm that was not there before. But the bad side is people think it should be done in a much more radical, in a much more comprehensive, and much more faster way than it is now. Changing the constitution because it is faulty in so many ways, rather than just amending a few articles in it. So basically, there is this kind of concern, definitely, on the political front, and it's not like everything is rosy, but I know that there is a demand for 1 million march this Friday, April 1st. The young people behind the revolution are trying to rally people, again using Facebook and new media, to come out this Friday, April 1st, in a massive march in Tahrir Square and other parts of Egypt, to try to put demand on the military council, which is now in charge in the country, to move forward with the changes and the transition to democratization at a much faster and much more radical form. Moving to the part about women, and then to the part about the Muslim Brotherhood, because that was a big question, Dr. Hel. The part about women, of course, again, it is not like a rosy picture where everything is going to be granted to women tomorrow morning on a golden plate. That is not the case. And I'll give you one example, of something which was not very optimistic, that, women on 8th of March, which is the International Women's Day, they tried to organize, some kind of march, and they tried to call for 1 million women's march in, Tahrir Square to demand, positive change for women and to demand women's rights and so on. Only about 500 women showed up to this event, and it was a big failure, with some men saying, go back to the kitchen or, whatever. So obviously, unless society itself is prepared for change and for reform, the media alone cannot bring about change. We don't want to underestimate, but we also do not want to overestimate the role of new media and the change that can happen in Egypt. It's not going to happen tomorrow morning. It's not going to happen overnight. It will need time in order to be processed effectively, and it will need time to rally more support among the wider Egyptian population. About the part about the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, let me just pinpoint that the Muslim Brotherhood is not Al-Qaeda. It's not a militant, armed extremist group as such. It's a group that has certain religious views, but it's also seeking to gain legitimacy and to be a player within the political arena. For many years, they have been denied this right to be political players. They were even called the banned group by the Egyptian government. Now they are trying to be active players and to be out in the light, which I think is a good thing, because every party or every group has to be represented, has to be given a platform and an arena, because if it's not, it's going to go underground, and that's when it can become militant and dangerous. And they even had their own women participating in the demonstrations and the protests. As I said, it was across the board. So you had veiled, face veiled, unveiled, westernized, everything you can think of. All women were there, and they were, joining hands, and they were together, and they were all about, change and reform. So I do not think, we don't want to, play the fears about, Islamization, or the Islamic trend is a trend that does have popularity in Egypt and in the Arab world. It's a fact. But that does not mean it has to necessarily be seen as a threat, because many of these Islamists are also people who are invested in democratization and reform, and they want to play by the rules, and they want women to be represented. They want it to be done within an Islamic framework, but they are not anti-democratization or anti-reform or anti-social people.
Yes, please just wait for the mic and identify yourself, please. Thank you.
My name is Hisham Jabi at MSI in Washington Management System International. Thank you very much for a very thoughtful presentation. I appreciate that. I just came back from Egypt doing 4 weeks of assessment for youth empowerment programming. And one of the questions I ask young people is, if this revolution happened in 1920, would it succeed? And they just paused a little bit, and they say, yeah, it will. Still will, without internet and media. I said, why? They said, because the will of young people and the Egyptian people was the foundation of this revolution, is not only the Facebook. So I sense that we probably sometimes sell the tools and the media as an enabler for the revolution. That's actually one comment. The other comment is, I think the role of the army was a significant role, because if you compare what's going on with Egypt versus Libya, you would understand how mature is the army in Egypt and how mature is the Egyptian society at large. The last point in terms of media is, Egypt is super duper concentrated and crowded city, and you have 22 million people. And the message is spreading like really like air inside Egypt. So there was also alternative way of spreading information, which is crowd in the street and people shouting at each other from one building to and I saw that. They shout at each other from one building to another, saying, "Oh, let's go!" And that's fascinating. Really, I was really impressed. The other quick.
I need the question because we have very little
The
time.
question is related, that's actually comment on the media, but the question is, I think young people are underestimating. Of course, the amendment, constitutional amendment on the 20th, I guess, was setback for young people in the revolution, because it does not give them enough time really to build their act together. And I'm a little bit concerned as an observer about their capability to really spread out outside Cairo and Alexandria. I was in Alexandria and especially in Bursaid, especially in Upper Egypt. So my question to you, how much do you envision the capability of these young people to really form political parties that are capable to talk to Falahi, Upper Egypt, simple person who has been receiving a lot of money from NDP, or the only message he received or she received through a mosque on Friday that, the savior are coming, and we had this dictatorship for 30 years. That's the message. So I would be interested to know your perspective.
Yeah, okay, I will try to be very brief
Yes,
in the
because
interest
we
of
have
time.
yes.
But regarding the role of the new media, yes, I agree with you that we should not underestimate and we should not also overestimate the role. We can see it as catalysts, at best, as catalysts for change or reform. They are not magic, they're not magical tools, and they cannot alone bring reform or change. So definitely we have to give credit to the people behind, the revolution, behind Facebook and behind all of these tools, and we should just see them as catalysts that can make change or reform go faster, right? This is the first part. The second part about the role of the military, yes, I agree with you that, definitely the Egyptian military did play a mature and very balanced role in terms of resolving this whole issue. And they were trying to really not side, with the government and use, a maximum force and oppression and suppression on the Egyptian people, especially when you look at the Libyan example, which led some Egyptians who, of course, are brilliant in making jokes, make a joke of saying, now people should make, a trillion march to apologize for Mubarak because, if you see other people's disasters, you should thank God for your own disaster. Of course, they're referring to what's going on in Libya now. So just one joke to show you how they are reacting to this. And the last part of your question about, how to reach the other people in other parts of the country or to form political parties. Let me just tell you that, I was just talking to my family back in Egypt yesterday, and they're very dissatisfied with some of the conditions that are now imposed on forming new political parties. That could be a major setback because they're asking for every new political party to have at least 5,000 members, and these members have to come from 5 different governorates, 300 in each governorate, and they should advertise in 2 major daily newspapers, and they should put all the names of the members in the newspapers. That alone is going to be a very inhibiting conditions, and it's going to be like £1 million just for them to do these very big, advertisements and announcements in the papers. It is just bizarre, you cannot just ask these young activists to meet these kinds of ridiculous conditions. So I really hope that there will be a demand to change some of these ridiculous rules, and I hope that this Friday, April the 1st, is going to be a decisive point in bringing about this kind of change.
You mean they'll send a message? Yes, please. Just wait.
I'm Brad Minnick, and I do a public diplomacy initiative here at the center. And I'm curious, how did the United States come out in this? Did the revolutionaries, the young people, perceive the United States government as being on their side, or was it waffling? And did they perceive the American people to be on their side? Because I know a lot of people were like tweeting and texting and saying, no matter what our government says, we're with you, we're with you. So what was, at the end of the day, what is the message that, or the impression that the revolutionaries, the people in the square, had about our government and our people's position on this?
Of course, whenever we talk about the government and the people, we have to always be very sensitive because we understand that governments are not people and people are not governments. And a lot of the dissatisfaction that has been going on in the Arab and Middle Eastern world has been, basically with the American government's or administration's foreign policy and not with the American people. As I always keep telling my students, this is not about the people, it's about the government's policy. So I think that there has been some kind of division of opinion. Again, like you mentioned, the government did seem to be waffling somehow in its own position at the beginning, being very conservative and not really wanting to tell Mubarak that he should go. But then when they actually saw the amount of enthusiasm and empowerment and the millions of people going out in the street, it was obvious that this change is just inevitable. And that's when the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton started to make very, in my opinion, very good messages and statements like, coercion and force and violence is not going to quiet people's grievances. The Egyptian president has to really listen to people now rather than later. So that's when we started to see a positive shift in the U.S. government, and I think that was acknowledged by the Egyptian people. So I think overall there was this kind of, at the beginning, skepticism about the waffling going back and forth in the American administration's position, but later on there was more admiration for it.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
All forgiven for 30 years of supporting dictator. I don't know if I can say that with confidence.
But following up on that question and your answer, for someone who witnessed the Iranian Revolution, it was amazing to see how internally the Egyptian Revolution, uprising, whatever,
Yes.
it was focused on internal issues. There were no death to America. The Palestinian-Israeli issue did not come up. It was all very internally. So, it wasn't as if the United States was also an element.
Yes,
or so.
that's right. Yes, you are absolutely correct. And Dr. Shibli Talhami, an expert in the University of Maryland, he said we should not make this revolution about Washington, because it's not about Washington. It's about what the Egyptian people want and need and demand.
Yes, thank you. There, please. Yeah. Just.
My name is Bora Karam. I'm from Sita Foundation. Thank you for your great presentation. I have a question about Muslim Brotherhood, because from newspapers and conferences, meetings, and etc., we're only hearing about, as a political party, just Muslim Brotherhood. What is Egyptian people's support on Muslim Brotherhood? From different sources, people are saying that 40%, 15%, or some say just 4%. But what is the reality? Since you have relevance and you have mother, father, and etc. living in Egypt, I wanted to ask you about this question. This thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's no really, unfortunately, some kind of credible or reliable source of information or polling or data that we can rely on to answer the question in terms of how much, because as you know, it has been a banned group. It has been, basically not allowed to play as an active, a recognized or legitimate player in the political arena. And that's why, for example, when they won seats before in the parliament, it was just as independent members. They were not affiliated with any particular party or any particular group. And unfortunately, there is no credible, reliable data that I can really cite now and tell you the percentage of people who would support it. But all I can tell you is that they did not lead the revolution. They cannot be given credit for the revolution. They were just one among many groups out there in Tahrir Square. And now what they are trying to do, which is being criticized, by the way, by some people in Egypt, is they're trying to, somehow side themselves with the military, establishment in order to gain some kind of political legitimacy. So some people, including my own father, are critical of this because they say, they should not run and just, side with the military in order to gain the legitimacy, because not everything that the military council is doing now is necessarily the best for the country. Taking the example of the temporary amendments in the constitution vis-a-vis a radical change and coming up with a new constitution altogether. So there is a division of opinion. And again, as I said, we should not really overblow the Islamophobia or the Islamic scare, because it's not going to be healthy. It's not going to help anybody.
Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Tariq, and I'm also an Egyptian American, and I'm from George Washington University. And thank you very much for your presentation. I have two quick questions, actually. One, do you think that the people's communication strategy would have succeeded had the government communication strategy been different? Had they not blocked cell phone technology, not blocked the use of the internet, had the government actually used that for their advantage, would the people's strategy may have been different or not as successful? And then maybe a short second question, what are the challenges that you see for the people in using the new media as we move forward? Thank you.
These are two very good questions. I'll try again to be as brief as possible. The first interesting question you said is, what would have happened if the government had used the media differently? I think that we would have still ended up with the same result. The people were sufficiently angry and sufficiently upset and dissatisfied with the situation going on in the ground, what's going on in the country for 30 years. But I think that, the poor or failed incompetent media strategy on the part of the government, as I said in my presentation, backfired and made things even worse for the government. Because just like the president and his government were very, incompetent, they always gave very little, very late. They also did the same in the communication arena. For example, after they cut the internet for a whole week, they started to actually do what you're talking about now. They started to form their own Facebook pages, a page which is called Na'am lil-Istiqrar, yes for stability. So in order to combat some of the activists. But it's too late. Already the revolution had started. People are already out in the millions. What are you talking about? What stability are you trying to sell to people at this stage? So my sisters were actually laughing about this, sending me messages and saying, oh, the moment they turned on the internet again, here you see these, websites and Facebook pages, calling for their own side of the story. But again, that's very little, very late. So I think that, definitely a different strategy would not have altered the result in the other direction, but their incompetent strategy did help in fueling the revolution even more. The second question was about the challenges going forward from here in terms of using the new media. I think the only challenge we can think of is if the government becomes smarter in terms of detecting or predicting how people can possibly use these fascinating tools of communication and what kind of power they might have. I was interviewed by the Voice of America Chinese program, the program which is directed to China. And, the anchor man was saying, oh, but China has been very effective in terms of curbing, its internet and trying to keep this kind of, firewall around the people. They call it the Great Firewall of China, as an irony. So, how come the Egyptian government did not do the same? I was like, oh, thank goodness they were not as, as efficient and as effective, because if they were, that could have really had a negative impact on the revolution.
Yes, please.
My name is Amin Mahmoud. I'm with the Egyptian Association for Change USA. I'd like to ask your opinion about the Supreme Military Council. I don't trust them myself, and I think they came in power without any legitimate transfer of power according to old constitution. And now, in my opinion, the continues of Mubarak regime exactly. They've been forced to act differently. If you remember the picture, sitting with Mubarak, ready to fire on the people, the younger officer who refused, and they've been forced to do that. And that's the reality which will come later. And for them to hijack the reform is a big mistake. That's why they make mistake after the other in this time, and I'd like to see your opinion. And regarding, I'll say one thing about the United States policies, is still, in my opinion also, they behind, they slow, and we see the marks in Yemen and Bahrain, they still dragging their feet.
Right. The first part of the question about the Military Supreme Council, yes, there are some voices in Egypt, as I said, which are dissatisfied with the pace of reform and change which the council is adopting. They think it's not fast enough. They think it's not efficient or effective enough. More radical steps should have been taken. They should have been taken faster and more drastically. So yes, there is this definite, discontent, and there is also the fear, like you mentioned, about, the military council being an extension, if you like, of the former regime or of President Mubarak, because he himself is a son of the military establishment, being a military man himself. So there is all of these doubts. But we cannot deny that while the revolution itself was taking place, they did not, crack down on the people. They were very clear in terms of not using force against the demonstrators, not using force against unarmed civilians, which at least, this part we have to give them credit for. But now, as we are in the transitional stage to democratization, I agree with you that there are so many question marks and so many concerns about the military council and its efficiency in terms of addressing these reforms and the pace of doing so. And about the U.S. policy, yes, I keep hearing all of these views like you just mentioned now about, the U.S. should act more quickly, should act more efficiently. So all of these, concerns are definitely out there too.
Thank you. Last question. Yes, please.
Great. Thank you again for an awesome presentation. There's been a lot of the democratic revolution was fueled in part by a lot of the economic unease that's going on in Egypt. Speaking to what you've just mentioned here recently about the patience of reforms, et cetera, we can't snap our fingers and make our economy turn around as the United States has figured out in the last couple of years. Economic growth takes a long time. Do you think the Egyptian people will have that patience to wait for these reforms to take effect, or is it going to be one of these situations where, like, well, this isn't working, isn't as much fun as we thought it would be, let's move to something else? Thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely a very important question and a big concern as well, because even while the revolution was taking place and people were out there rallying in Tahrir Square and many of the young activists sleeping on the street, in the pavement on Tahrir Square, there were these voices who were saying, come on, our economic life is not getting any better. We're not able to get to work. We're not able to go out buying our, meat and vegetables and fruits. And of course, we have seen these, kinds of voices going back and forth. The peace activists saying, the political activists saying, come on, we are trying to change this country, change the future. And you're talking about meat and vegetables and fruits and transportation. What kind of trivial issues are these? But, when you come down to the realities of everyday life, yes, I would say that is a big question. I do not have an answer for it right now, unfortunately, but I think definitely the pace with which the economic growth and the economic development is also going to take place is definitely going to be a key factor. It's not less important than the pace of political change or political reform. It's an equally important factor. And whether the people are really going to fight the rest of the battle and really be able to take the time and the effort needed for these economic reforms to be, re-envisioned and restated is something that remains to be seen.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Sahar Mohammad Khamis.
Thank you very much.